Our episode begins in the castle, with Lloyd's brother getting ready. He opens the library door where Lloyd was reading some books with Grimm's presence, and Grimm warns Lloyd that someone is coming, so Lloyd asks him to hide. Albert calls for Lloyd. Albert is training and hits a fireball on the number 9 plate. Everyone is impressed. Lloyd thinks Albert is really good. He was the second prince of the Kingdom of Saloon. Albert had the authority to access all the castle facilities and even invited Lloyd to go with him. It was one of the rare opportunities for Lloyd to use magic in the castle, so he was very grateful. Albert says it's Lloyd's turn. Lloyd steps forward to try his turn. Lloyd didn't care about the throne. If he attracted too much attention, he would be dragged into the succession dispute. All Lloyd wanted was to study magic without drawing attention, so he had to hide his true power. Lloyd was going to make the fireballs curve so that they only grazed the target. For Grimm, this was more difficult than just hitting the target directly. And then Lloyd launches the fireball and it grazes the target. He hits everyone but only grazes them, just as he wanted. A man watching thought Lloyd had talent, but grazing hits were all he could manage. Grimm thinks the guy doesn't understand how complex that was. Lloyd thinks adding rotation to the fireballs wasn't so bad. He could use less mana and make the trajectory more stable, not to mention it was just as fast. Grimm saw that Lloyd was crazy about magic. Albert says they would take a break and Lloyd could play a bit if he wanted. Lloyd is very happy. He had an empty shooting gallery and there were many things he would like to try. Grimm is curious and asks what he wanted to try. Lloyd replies that he had Grimm's true of double enchantment, for example. Grimm thinks that's impossible. Double enchantments are an exclusive trick of demons who can create another mouth. In that case, Lloyd removes the glove from his hand and Grimm enters his hand, and now he has 2 mouths. Grimm questions it because even if someone thought of it, they would never do it. After all, who would assimilate a demon into their body? And Lloyd tries to synchronize with Grimm and asks if Grimm could cast the impetuous fireball. Grimm reminds Lloyd that he's a demon. A bit of advanced magic would be a piece of cake for him. And then the two start the magic. But at the moment, Grimm freaks out. Lloyd asks what the problem is, and Grimm says he should be asking that. What the hell was that? And Lloyd says it's a stack of spells. They were a way to abbreviate spells that require incantations. By mixing the incantations of various spells, they could reduce the time to activate them. Following that methodology, Lloyd was trying 100 different enchantments. Grimm thinks it's impossible to try more than 100 enchantments at once. A single stack would have 2 or maybe 3 enchantments at the same time. But for Lloyd, it would take an eternity. And Lloyd tries to talk with Grimm's mouth and he succeeds. Lloyd realizes he can talk with both mouths. Grimm is scared because Lloyd was going to try 2 advanced enchantments at once. Lloyd apologizes, but he needed to use Grimm's mouth at that moment. And then he prepares to elaborate the enchantment, leaving Grimm completely shocked. It was incredible. They were advanced magic of 2 completely different types. Lloyd was merging the 2 magics. It was an unreal increase in mana. Grimm goes crazy seeing all that, and then the double enchantment is really done. Lloyd wasn't sure, but he shouldn't release that magic on the surface. The explosion of magic was so huge that everyone in the city saw it. Next, Albert is having tea, and a man asks why Albert pays so much attention to the 7th prince. Lloyd had talent for magic, but he was still just a child to that man. Albert replies, saying they didn't have eyes for talent. Lloyd's fireballs hit the targets in the same way. Albert thinks Lloyd probably did that intentionally. To Albert, Lloyd was a prodigy. He could become a great sage someday, and then he would be a great asset to Albert one day. Another man who was with Albert was assuming that as a future king, of course, Albert would obtain the services of the great sage. Albert asks him to stop that. He just wanted to get along with his little brother. Albert imagines that until that moment, Lloyd had hit all the targets. For the man, that was an exaggeration. The man looks out the window and finds it strange that the sun was already setting. Next, we see Grimm completely shocked by what had happened because Lloyd had opened a hole in the sky and the night was shining. Lloyd realizes what he did and asks the sun to come back. Grimm wonders how all that was possible. Lloyd was truly startled this time. Grimm wondered what the hell that kid was. Then Grimm sees in the newspaper about a mysterious hole in the sky. It would be weird weather or a bad omen. Grimm tells Lloyd that yesterday's feat made it to the news. Lloyd says he panicked for a few seconds. Grimm tells Lloyd to take a look at it. A group of rank adventurers cleans a difficult dungeon and collects treasure. Lloyd hears that and says it's a great chance to bring bring home a bunch of magic-powered items and decides that they would go to a dungeon. Grim tells him to wait. He couldn't go because the castle staff would freak out if they didn't see him around. Lloyd replies to Grim, saying it's okay because with a little magic and ingenuity, he would solve the problem. Grim doesn't quite understand, and Lloyd says it's a plant class spell, then he blows. It was a wooden replica of himself, so no one would suspect. Grim finds all that incredible because it was a very perfect replica. It wasn't just in appearance, the resin mimicked bones, skin, and the roots functioned as a circulatory system. The replica could even make some movements on its own. Grim thinks with a doppelganger like that, he could finally leave. Lloyd says no, if it were that easy, he would have left already. Lloyd's real problem was Silpha. Another day, Silpha told Lloyd he had grown a bit more, a few millimeters, and she already saw the difference. It would be very difficult to deceive her with a doppelganger that could only dance around like a fool. And then Lloyd leaves. He asks if Grim was listening while he was flying. Grim replies that he could indeed. Lloyd asks how things were going over there. Lloyd said he wasn't sure, but he thought he was replacing himself very well. The maids said Lloyd was more vain. Grim thought putting his mind into the doll and then sticking his body into Lloyd's hand separately was very bizarre. It was like the kid didn't know when to stop. Lloyd asks Grim to keep an eye on Silpha and keep pretending to be him. Grim acknowledges that the copy was very good. It even had mana circulation. Grim realizes that now that the kid was out for a moment, he could do whatever he wanted without interruptions. But at that very moment, Lloyd speaks to him. Lloyd tells him that he's very happy Grim is his familiar and says he's counting on him. Upon hearing that, Grim cries and doesn't say anything. Lloyd asks if he's listening, and Grim says it was nothing and tells him to come back soon. Lloyd, not understanding much, says it's okay. The problem for Lloyd is that despite leaving the castle, he had no idea where there was a dungeon. He really put the cart before the horse. At that moment, there was a girl with pink hair running away from some orcs. So there she is, running like the wind from those big, bad orcs. But suddenly, she puts on the brakes and decides to give one of them a good kick, so strong it sticks right into the monster's gut. She takes them all down in one fell swoop. Lloyd spots warrior written on her back and figures she must be one of those martial arts types. The way she's breathing is impressive, let me tell you. She tells those foolish orcs to try again in 100 years. Now Lloyd, he's chatting with Grim about this Kai energy thing they use outside. You know, they channel it through their bodies by breathing. Lloyd read about it in some book, says it allows for some pretty wild techniques. Meanwhile, this pink-haired gal notices him hiding up there and wants to know who he is. Lloyd figures he'd better come clean. After all, he's got questions about dungeons and Kai. But Grim thinks it's as clear as day that if he just showed up as himself, the 7th Prince of Saloom, well, that'd raise some eyebrows. Lloyd thinks Grim might be onto something. So, when the pink-haired girl doesn't get a response, she jumps to the conclusion that he's an enemy and decides to pay him a visit. She gets right up in his face and tells him to get ready. But Lloyd's got a trick up his sleeve, or rather in his hand. He introduces himself as Robert, a newbie adventurer. The girl's stunned. She thinks Robert's a real catch. Lloyd's thinking his illusion spell, the double disguise thing, is pretty handy. He's using the double enchantment he learned from Grim. One hand looks like him, the other like Albert. Put them together and a brand new look. So, the girl introduces herself as Tao, a rank B adventurer and, as Lloyd can see, a martial artist. Lloyd's all polite, shaking her hand while asking Grim if she suspects anything. Grim thinks the disguise is spot on. Tao's smitten cause she thinks Robert's a real hunk. Now, Tao's spent 18 years training at the dojo, hoping to meet someone. But all the guys she knew were chasing after priestesses. She never stood a chance. But now, her luck's finally changing cause she's set her sights on Robert. Lloyd was hoping they could go dungeon diving together, but since she's busy, he figures he'll take off. But Tao insists he can count on her. Lloyd finds it a bit weird, but he's grateful. Next thing you know, they're at the entrance to a dungeon where Tao's taking on an orc. She asks Robert if he saw her in action and fell for her strength, but he's too busy collecting shiny rocks. Tao's bummed cause he didn't even notice. Lloyd asks if she's adventuring solo, and she confirms it, saying she hasn't found a decent partner yet. Grim wonders if Lloyd's decent enough. Later, they're sitting around a campfire cooking up dinner. Lloyd asks if Tao used Kai for those attacks, and she's surprised he knows about it. Not many folks on that continent do. Lloyd explains it's kinda like mana in magic, and breathing's supposedly important. Tao's impressed he noticed and says she's out of of breath. Lloyd explains how Kai training starts and ends with breathing. You use your breath to circulate the Kai, giving you explosive power beyond the norm. But while Tao's explaining, Lloyd starts breathing too and ends up controlling his Kai, leaving Tao completely floored. He just copied her breathing and managed it. She's shocked he pulled it off just by watching. Lloyd feels a separate energy from mana in his body. He could definitely put that to good use in his magic. Tao suggests she could teach him since he's so interested, and Lloyd is over the moon. Grimm thinks the kid is really weird as the maid serves him a strawberry tart. He figures Lloyd has a cushy life, but he couldn't care less about all that. He's only interested in magic research. Then Silpha shows up, looking for Lloyd. Next thing you know, Tao's taking down the dungeon boss with her Kai burst skill, but she figures the dungeon treasure won't be anything special since it's underdeveloped. Lloyd, on the other hand, finds it all fascinating. He's curious about what's inside that chest and keeps using his Kai breathing, with Tao watching in amazement as he quickly learns to control it. She thinks even her grandpa would approve of him as her fiancé, but Lloyd is more anxious to crack open that treasure chest. When Tao tries to open it, a magical trap springs from the chest, but Lloyd manages to shield her. Turns out, the real boss was a lick.